Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another Prevalent webinar. Nice to see the numbers trickling in. And while you guys are here, I'm going to launch a poll since you guys are getting situated. We're curious as to what's your interest in coming here? You know, what prompted you to join this webinar today? Is it for education? Are you a customer? Are you lost? Maybe you'll learn something. Who knows? Are you doing project research for third-party risk management? We'd love to know what prompted this, what struck a chord for you if it was the topic, which is 3 things every third-party cyber attack has in common. And we do have a very special guest today. We have Norman Menz, co-founder of Prevalent, and also our very own Scott Lang, VP of Product Marketing, that will be joining us. We're really excited about this one, but I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping items. This is being recorded. It'll be in your inbox tomorrow, but you guys are all muted, so we're not going to be able to see you or hear you, but I really want to utilize the Q&A as much as possible. So if anyone has any questions that are burning, out of your fingertips and you want to talk about it right now, let me know. We'll pop in if we see fit, but normally we usually wait to the end for Q&A. Always utilize the chat if needed, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, and we do want to keep this interactive. So like I said, let's ask as many questions to Norman as we can. It's a hot topic. We're excited. That's about all from me. I will pop in whenever you guys are talking, and I'm going to throw it over to Norman, and I'm going to stop the poll. So take it away. Norman, I can't hear you. I don't know if you're having audio problems.
Excellent. How is that?
I'm glad I stayed on camera. I was like, am I being pranked? Did I mess this up? Okay. All right. That's all for now. Good luck, Norman. Take care.
Thank you, Amanda. I'll probably get it better the second time. So it's great to be here today. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I'm pretty excited to talk about our topic here today, which are the 3 things every third-party cyber attack has in common. And one of the things I wanted to start with, and it may get the ire of some of you, but I really wanted to start back in 2013 when we start talking about supply chain cyber attacks. And I wanted to talk about the target breach. And I think we've all heard this one, and we think it's been run through the ringer a bunch of times. But what's really interesting, not only the fact is that was 8 years ago, but it was really a seminal moment in third-party risk management where it forced organizations to stop and think differently about how they identified third parties. And I'm sure everyone is well aware of the example, but if we do dial it back, it really dealt with a company, a third party called Fazio Refrigeration, that was a service provider to Target and was essentially responsible for the management and the maintenance of the refrigeration systems in some of the Target stores. And so nobody would ever identify a refrigeration vendor as a critical third party. But what had been overlooked was the fact of what they had access to. And that Target breach was really just one of opportunity. Target wasn't specifically targeted, pun intended, but it turned out to be the largest, data breach at the time, and millions of dollars worth of fines. And, obviously we've heard about the outcome of that. But as a result of that, when people looked at it, we started to identify critical vendors in terms of not necessarily who they were or what service that they provided for your organization, but it's also potentially what they may have access to. And seemingly innocent access, for monitoring of refrigeration systems led to, at the time, the biggest data breach. And so that was a pivotal moment for us, but it's not much different than what we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years when we start talking about supply chain attacks. And what we're seeing now is we're seeing, similar to the Target breach, where again, it was somewhat seemingly random, right? It was opportunistic, right? Somebody happened to get into the Fazio environment and then realized that they had access to Target. We really see, to some extent, it's analogous with what we're seeing with the third-party supply chain attacks. However, the extent at which these attacks occur and the impact of them is much more significant. So I equate it back to 2013 and even up through 2019. We generally looked at kind of the the risk and the scope of third-party attack like an iceberg, but as you see here, as we're trying to represent in this example, the visible piece of it is relatively or proportionately the size of the part below the surface. But a lot of that has changed over the last 2 years. And if we look now specifically at the third-party risk landscape in 2021, especially as it's now accentuated by the supply chain attacks, we see that the problem below the surface is significantly larger. And so we wanted to spend today's time really talking about that. And you see from some of the statistics here that we're looking at that, 51% of businesses have suffered some type of a data breach caused by a third party. And then we look at the supply chain attacks, and a lot of them, and we're going to talk about 3 of them here today, but the majority of those data breaches were the result of a vendor being given too much access. And the funny thing is that's not really much different than what happened with Target back in 2013. And I'm sure as we've all been tracking over the last couple of years, the average cost of a data breach continues to increase, and it's just over $4 million at this point. So what I wanted to do with this as the backdrop was really talk about a couple of things today. We wanted to talk about 3 examples of third-party supply chain risk. We wanted to look at the motivations behind these attacks. I wanted to take a specific topical example of a potential supply chain attack that I witnessed to actually just back in July, so something very recent, talk about potentially how easy it is sometimes to infiltrate a third party, look at the 3 common elements and 4 causes of the third-party cyber attacks, and then finally discuss how your organization can potentially respond if you're involved in a third-party cyber attack. So look at, we have 3 examples here on the size, and certainly there's many more of them. In fact, there's been some research done recently at the University of Surrey in conjunction with IBM, where they said essentially over the last couple of years that the number of supply chain cyber attacks has doubled. But I picked these 3. I'm sure many of you are aware of them, but they each have essentially some differences, but there's also a lot of commonality. And the first one we wanted to talk about was the SolarWinds attack. And my point of bringing these up is not to go into the technical nature and aspect of each one of these attacks and how it was infiltrated and what happened, but really the things that we want to consider when we're thinking about potentially how we may be involved in these from our third parties, and things that we can consider and avoid. So it's good to understand kind of the characteristics, if you will, and the nature of that. So I highlighted the SolarWinds one because it really deals essentially with the scale. And so the thing that's dangerous about all of these supply chain attacks is they essentially allow this exponential access or infiltration into people's networks. So again, we're going to talk about the 3 common elements. But when we look at SolarWinds, I mean, they have over 300,000 customers. They believe over 1,800 of them were specifically exposed because they were running versions of the software on premise. And it went undetected for many months. It was over 9 months where it was ultimately where it was detected, and then it started to get the serious attention that it wanted. But ultimately, what happened with the SolarWinds one is it had allowed, and it was a very sophisticated attack. And quite frankly, with all of these, they were all very sophisticated attacks. As we'll see, they all had nation state backing or support for each one of these. And the SolarWinds one in particular was very stealthy, right? So it was definitely a low and slow. There was a lot of obfuscation of the activity. There was a lot of things done within the code to make sure that it wasn't easily traceable and detectable. And the intent of this one was to really get as much information as was possible. And Brad Smith, who's a president at Microsoft, estimated there were probably over 1,000 people, threat actors involved in the SolarWinds breach. So tremendous amount of resources that were committed to making this happen. The Kaseya one is slightly different. So in the case of SolarWinds, they were trying to be stealthy and quiet and really try to exfiltrate as much data as possible. The Kaseya one, was more ransomware. So there was definitely more of a clearly financial gain than there was intellectual property. around that. Again, this one was state sponsored. And this one was more interesting in terms of, how it evolved. But, with the SolarWinds one, we had 18,000 organizations potentially exposed. And there was, in SolarWinds in particular, they had infiltrated essentially, if you will, kind of the distribution supply chain, similarly to Kaseya, where they were able to get involved in the patching or the deployment of that software into the customer's environment within SolarWinds. So people unwittingly or unknowingly were essentially deploying this malware, which ultimately led to this. As a quick correction, the Kaseya one was different, where it was an exploit of some vulnerabilities in that, but ultimately you had only 50 of Kaseya's direct customers, because it's a platform commonly used by MSSPs, but because those MSSPs were supporting many of their customers, so they're indirect third parties, there were as many as 1,500 organizations potentially exposed, right? So you see that downstream effect of really kind of true supply chain management. The Microsoft one is interesting as well. So this one was also state sponsored, and this one evolved very quickly. So the first time that it was discovered, there was some activity, there was some talk, and there was some published proof of exploit that was posted on GitHub, et cetera. And it essentially made the attackers aware that their window of opportunity was closing down. And this is why it's referred to as a smash and grab attack, because essentially what happened is, people either started reverse engineering these, and specifically these were exploitations of zero-day vulnerabilities in Exchange. But as the window of opportunity was closing down, people were being very aggressive and very malicious with this, in terms of affecting that. So at the end of the day, you have over 30,000 organizations that were affected. And because of the nature of it, was really a free-for-all, because once it became publicly known that these vulnerabilities existed and there were proof of concepts available, you had many people jumping in. So you had organizations that were trying to remediate this, and you may have 2 or 3 or more different threat actor groups in your organization, essentially piggybacking off of this exploit. So, essentially what we're seeing here is, in the past, when we worried about our third parties, or we just worried about our cybersecurity posture in general, sometimes it's random where you see ransomware, sometimes they're targeted. If we have very specific assets or financial gain opportunities that are of interest to different threat actors, what's interesting about this is, instead of them focusing on the individual organizations, they're obviously focusing on the trusted software developers, service providers, et cetera, and that gives them really exponential scale, to perform these activities in mass. And so what we want to do is really talk about some of the motivations around these supply chains attacks. Some of them are the most obvious, right? So we look at the traditional reasons of stealing data and financial gain. And, I've made arguments in the past that stealing data and financial gain are really the same thing, because at the end of the day, that financial gain that's being obtained is really through the theft of some type of data, whether it be credit card information or some other type of fraudulent activity. But what we're starting to see with, just as an overall evolution, and some of it very specific to supply chain attacks, is these new motivations, right? And so some of them are around promoting distrust and dissidence. And it's not really a big surprise. Some of these cyber attacks were launched, for example, if you want to look at it from a US perspective, and it's happening in Europe and other parts of the world as well, they're launched, when we're going through political turmoil. So when the US Capitol is being stormed, that's when one of these supply chain attacks is launched. So they're looking to take advantage of the chaos. But then some of them, when we look at the election meddling that's happened, by some nation states in Europe, in the United States, other parts of the world, in Africa, et cetera, they're really intending to kind of promote distrust and dissidence. The other thing that's happened, as we've seen kind of evolve, is ransomware, right? So originally ransomware was, it started out as financial gain. You need to send us Bitcoin in order to decrypt this. Then they started using ransomware for data exfiltration. And now it's being used essentially to publicly shame organizations, where even if the ransom is or isn't paid, or if data is exfiltrated, sometimes people are taking damning information and they're posting that up on the internet, to shame these organizations or perhaps their customers, depending on those examples. And then obviously we did talk a little bit about geopolitical. I think that really speaks to the first point. And then the last one is really the Trojan horse. And I think this is really similar as well, as if you look at the sophistication of some of these attacks, the supply chain attacks that we just mentioned previously, a lot of times these are Trojan horses into the customer's environment. As we talk about some of the common elements, we'll drill on that more, but essentially they're targeting trusted platforms that typically have a lot of access across a network. So as I mentioned before, I wanted to talk about a real world example, certainly not that the first three supply chain attacks weren't real world examples, but I wanted to talk to one that was very topical, that just happened recently, that I think really speaks to the ease at which a third party can potentially be compromised. And obviously this speaks to a third party as well, but this is a particular instance that happened in July. It happened and evolved very quickly, but we had a financial organization, a first party, monitoring their third party, doing continuous dark web monitoring. And as part of that, what they discovered of talk on one of the dark web forums was they talked about a set of credentials that were being sold. And if you look at the dark web postings, when you see this, they'll typically give some type of an indication of the organization that the credentials are related to, and then the type of information that they have. And I'm not talking about simply password leaks, which we see a lot of, but a lot of times you have session information that's been captured, cookie information, which can be exploited. And so this first party found this out about their third party. Their third party happens to be a software application developer. And so what they did was contact the third party. They let them know that they found this information, and then they worked with them to get their authorization to actually validate that. And so with that, they were essentially able to buy these credentials in Bitcoin for about $100 US. And very quickly, within a few hours, they were able to confirm that with the information provided, that they were able to get access to a system. In this case, it was an email server, and get access to a user's inbox and have access to sensitive data. And then obviously it can go very quickly from there, as we've seen in other examples. I think the EA games one we saw was very similar to this, where they got access to this type of credential information. Then they were then able to use that to get access to to EA Slack environment, and then they used that for social engineering, essentially, to promote their access throughout the environment. And so again, this is very simply how these things can happen very quickly. If we look at the SolarWinds one, it's attributed that this was likely due to weak authentication management around that. And again, just a simple example of how this can happen, each and every day. So we've taken 3 examples that we hear about that are very prominent in the news. The threat is very real, and in many instances, it's very straightforward, depending on the motives of the threat actors. Next, we want to talk about the 3 common elements, and this is actually probably the most basic or most straightforward part of what we look at here when we look at supply chain attacks, and especially the most recent ones. And it's very easy to see the commonality, right? So we've got nation state-backed cyber attacks, and some of them are very easy to attribute. And in terms of the overwhelming predominance of the attacks that we've mentioned, 2 of them are highly attributable, likely to activity and support from Russia, and the third one from China, and the third one being the Microsoft Exchange exploit. And so we're seeing, allowing of the activity to happen. So backing or support, if you will, for some of these resources, and especially if we look, at the SolarWinds one, where if we have 1,000+ people involved in that, it requires tremendous coordination, tremendous resources, financial, et cetera, around that. And it really becomes very difficult. If you look at the analysis, a lot of these high-profile attacks, the security experts all say some of these are very difficult to protect against and to detect. And that's because of the resources available to these groups and the motivations of these groups. The second one is they're targeting very high value trusted resources. And so, prior to this, a lot of times if you were looking at targeted attacks, you'd pick a particular organization, maybe it's one in healthcare, maybe it's financial services, maybe it's in technology, and there was specific information that you wanted to obtain for them. When you look at the SolarWinds example, or if we look at the Kaseya example, they targeted trusted platforms, right? And there's been some criticism potentially of SolarWinds because from a marketing perspective, they listed who all their high profile customers were, right? It's not unusual to go to a technology vendor's website or any company and see all of their customers. And, SolarWinds talked about having 300,000 customers. And so we're not for certain that was the reason why they were targeted, but certainly, it made it very easy that they would be potentially a good target. And so the other thing that's very common, both about SolarWinds, which is network monitoring tools, and Kaseya, which is tools for managing systems for MSSPs, is these are typically deployed into environments and parts of the network that are highly trusted. A lot of them are agents that people are installing on servers, they're installing on laptops. They have high degrees of freedom. Oftentimes they're allowed to operate with administrative privileges. And in some instances, the way in which they operate, you have to remove some security controls on operating systems in order for these to run. So again, very effective. We'll talk about lessons learned here, but definitely easy to get and gain access to a great number of systems and resources and organizations, based on the fact that these are trusted. And then as we talked a lot about, we just get to attack at scale, essentially. I think a great example, going back to Kaseya, is you only had 50 MSSPs using the Kaseya platform that were affected, but that ultimately affected as many as, 15 or 1,800 customers. So you just have a lot of leverage, if you will, from that perspective. So these are some of the three common elements that, that we see. Next, we wanted to look at some of the causes. And this one, I think, speaks, the first one, so a lack of risk-based tiering of third parties. This speaks to, going back to the target breach in 2013. And even if we look at a lot of the statistics today, the organizations that are doing third-party risk management that have actually indicated, again, if we go back to the Poneman study, some of the research that Prevalent has done and published as well, when we look at the organizations that have a formal third-party risk management program, very few organizations, less than 50% of them, actually are doing risk-based tiering of third parties. And so when we look at kind of the best practices here, they haven't changed. And I would say, unfortunately, they haven't really changed much in the last 8 years. But it's important, obviously, for organizations to maintain an inventory of suppliers and service providers. And then further to that, to do a risk-based approach to determining how you want to tier them. And the tiering determines the level of assessment and monitoring that you're going to do on that organization. Again, not just based on the nature of the service they're providing, potentially what they have access to. Those things are all important. And then one of the things I thought it'd be important to highlight here, a lot of times we talk about establishing that risk-based approach and then doing an assessment of the vendor and then looking at their controls to determine how you want to manage the vendor. But it's really important on an ongoing basis, especially periodically or as the nature of the service may potentially change, is to involve the internal business owner. So this is the buyer of the service, the user of the vendor, et cetera. And ask not only the vendor what data do you have access and what controls do you have and what systems, but also verify that internally with your internal stakeholders just to make sure that we're seeing the full picture of the potential risk of different vendors. And then obviously that covers off on the third point here as well, is to make sure we're looking at not the service they provide, but what they can potentially gain access to. And that starts to open up this realm of possibility when we start looking at the technology exposure, again, using different systems, like we've talked about in some of these other breaches in your environment. Even at something as generic, for example, and I think the Microsoft one is a little bit different than some of the supply chain attacks that we've talked about, but you have something as ubiquitous in an environment such as an email server and services that are deployed globally in most organizations, and the fact that that they present risk and exposure to your organization on a daily basis. So that's the first cause that we wanted to look at. The second one is an over-reliance on contracts and reputation, and this one was really interesting to me. So if we talk about before, there's a statistic from Poneman that says 64% of businesses are not confident that their third parties would notify them of a breach involving sensitive or confidential data. And then we've also said that a lot of organizations, that study further goes on to say that up to 50% of the organizations rely on the reputation of the vendor to essentially to determine that they don't need to do any due diligence or vendor risk management. And in the Prevalent study, again, it kind of supports that there's not enough pre-contract due diligence. So we really recommend and seeing that, it's a carrot and stick example to some extent, but pre-contract with your vendor is where you have the opportunity and the most leverage with them. And so it's really important to understand at least a preliminary assessment of the vendor prior to contract, as a business, not only spending and committing financial resources to it, but even in terms of spinning up projects and whatnot, about whether or not that is the best fit from a risk perspective. So, certainly that's important. The other thing, that it's important too is it's not a one-time assessment is not enough. Whether it's at the beginning of the contract, there should be some form of periodic assessment that you do at least annually or when the risk profile changes. And that means there needs to be, so if it's not being done on a periodic basis, there needs to be some other type of trigger that you can follow if the nature of your relationship with the vendor changes. If, for example, you see something from a threat monitoring perspective, a continuous threat monitoring perspective, that might suggest that you need to either reevaluate your relationship or reassess the vendor, these things all need to occur. And they can be other triggers such as spend and things of that nature. And when we talk about the continuous monitoring, the point of it is when we do an assessment, you only know what you've asked and what the vendor's told you. And that's a point in time. The continuous monitoring gives us some insight into those questions that we haven't asked, and they give it to us as things are evolving, right? So getting back to that example that we talked about earlier, where we found credentials for a particular third-party organization on the internet, that's something that may have just popped up a few days ago or, even a few months ago. And so you want to be aware of that and make sure that you have as much insight into the posture of your vendor as is possible, and using these tools and automation to make that manageable. So the next kind of cause here is, and in that point we talked about earlier, 74% of all third-party data breaches were a result of over-provisioning of access. And then, if we look at kind of the deeper technical analysis of some of these supply chain attacks, we also look at lack of monitoring of credentials. So the most important thing is really applying the principle of least privilege. Don't give people more access than they need. The other thing that, I think even SolarWinds in particular came out, one of the corrective controls that they put in place after the breach was they implemented multi-factor authentication requirements for every user in the organization. And I think that's a clear indication, of kind of the point and nature of attack against SolarWinds. It's clearly been a best practice for a number of years. And it's something that you should ensure and require that your vendors are doing well. It's one of the most effective means of mitigation. The other one too is, we always want to reduce the scope and exposure. And so when we look at these trusted systems and the examples we talked about, we should do everything possible when we are deploying them to make sure that we can isolate them as much as possible. Excuse me for a second. So, and then the other thing is we look at now at the monitoring aspect of it. We want to monitor our vendor accounts. We want to see how they're being used, possibly to put systems in place to detect any anomalous behavior, things that we don't expect to see, or things that are changing from the usual practice. And then the last one here that we talked about goes back to that other example. Where possible, monitor dark web mentions of your vendors, their company, any type of identifiers for them, even their domain, to see if things like if discussions are happening, maybe even notifications of breaches or potential availability of credentials in those environments. And then the last one here that we wanted to look at is the cause is much more technical, but if you start to analyze kind of more deeply what's happening with some of these, and especially around our software vendors, is we want to talk to the vendors and find out what they're doing. A lot of times we talk to them about the people that they employ in their environment and making sure that those people are trusted and that they're not going to put backdoors in the product. But when we look at SolarWinds, for example, right, like somebody compromised essentially the build process. They interrupted the build process, they broke its integrity, and they used that essentially to put a payload in that was then that was digitally signed. It was valid, but it contained that malware. So it's a very difficult problem, and I don't want to suggest that this is easy, but it is important to start having these conversations and making sure that vendors are aware of this and that they are putting systems in place and continuously evaluating and improving their process. The other thing that's really important is to work with the vendors specifically about the SDLC and making sure that they're doing periodic manual penetration testing, and ideally that they've also built up an operational procedure where they're automating that as well. Again, it's just improving the quality of the code. They're also making them much more aware of that and potentially reducing things like vulnerabilities that we may see that may be exploited. The third thing here that we talk about is similar to the first. It's certainly much more advanced, but talk to the vendor about what type of behavioral profiling that they're doing and seeing if they're doing any type of baseline. Are they assessing it? Do they essentially know what normal traffic looks like for the application? And as we dovetail into the next one, is that will help inform them of a minimum deployment configuration, right? So what are the requirements to deploy this in the most secure manner possible that's least privileged, allowing us to do things like restrict the permissions of the processes that are running, and then limiting the traffic in and out of these servers and these applications. So should, as we kind of move into the next phase of it, you know, should your organization be involved in a cyber attack? You know, what are the best ways for you to respond? And the first one is I think it's very obvious, but I think it's really the one that provides the most value to the organization, which is just be you know, prepared ahead of time. So an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, as they say, and it certainly holds true here as well. And as part of that, we want to make sure that vendor data breaches and cyber attack scenarios are part of your incident response program. So these scenarios should be part of them. You should have communication plans that are already built should they happen, and different responses that your organization is going to do. In some of them, with a lot of them, the initial response was shut these systems down, and that might be the most valid response. And so looking at things such as containment, how do we want to message it publicly? If we have other downstream parties that are affected, how do we assess that? How do we contain it? How do we communicate it? Is very important. And then, you know, of course, as best practice and as you do in any type of cyber incident, is you perform that forensics, right? So you want to look at the exposure of your organization systems and data post-breach. You may want to go and do some dark web monitoring and just determine, if you can, when did this information appear, if it was on the dark web, or what's out there today? Has any of my data been exfiltrated? Is it being sold? You know, is it being used against my organization? And then the fourth one is, you know, we want to make sure that we learn from this. So we want to update our third-party risk management programs. We want to look on a periodic basis and make sure that we're using best practices in terms of building out our assessments, performing our continuous monitoring, et cetera. So I want to just take this time just to talk about this. It's something that's very interesting, especially at the rate at which it's evolving. Unfortunately, and this is not fear mongering by any regard, but this is obviously a real problem, and some of these are very difficult. We've got highly enabled threat actors working against us, and you know, as a community, it's best that we can continue to work together. We can and learn from these and continue to improve. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk about this topic here today. I'm going to hand it now over to Scott Lang, who's going to maybe talk to us about some of the practical things that we can do leveraging Prevalent to help assist with this problem.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much, Norman. I really appreciate the time you gave to us today to kind of walk through and diagram some of these, very high-profile cyber attacks that have, found a path through a third party, into an organization. And one of the big takeaways for me from Norman's presentation is that you're never going to be able to stop a cyber attack, every cyber attack. That's, I think, universally understood. But a little bit of predictability or prevention or proactiveness, and to continue that alliteration there, set the stage ahead of time with better visibility into vendor controls, vendor cybersecurity controls, how their incident response plans are built, gives you some of that insight to say, okay, this is how these folks would be able to respond quickly if one of these types of attacks would happen, which would then downstream mitigate the risk that I would have, or that there would be an impact to my organization. So, next slide, please. In the process of being, more proactive and kind of setting the stage for a more programmatic third-party risk management process, I think there are three big issues that you have probably faced or are facing, and many companies like you have gone through as well. And that's first, it's super difficult to get a handle on the security controls or privacy controls or data governance controls of a third party just by using some sort of a spreadsheet-based process that you exchange over email. I think we understand that's a bit of a pain, a time sucker, and just doesn't produce the results if it's being shared. There's not a lot of data integrity there, and there's no good chain of custody on some of the answers and such that could really make it not provable from a compliance perspective. Second, regarding data, oftentimes you execute some sort of an assessment. Perhaps it's an annual assessment, if that's what the contract requires, and then the day after that assessment is logged and risks are managed and remediation happens, a lot can happen after that, between that point and the next annual assessment. So, data tends to be outdated, tends to be highly manual. The third big blocker that kind of gets in the way of doing third-party risk management successfully are all the different folks in your organizations that have a hand in it. So, perhaps it's owned by you or, the IT security team, perhaps it's owned by contracts or procurement. But a lot of different folks want to have, some influence over how to manage a vendor or to understand and mitigate vendor risks, each from a slightly different perspective. And that complicates and adds a lot of time to the process that we find that organizations just don't have the resources to manage. So as we move to the next slide, our approach to tackling third-party risk is to address it right from the beginning, nip it in the bud, if you will, by looking at risk at every stage of the vendor risk lifecycle. Everything from the sourcing and selection of vendors, by giving you some visibility into their security practices, data privacy practices, and more, before you even onboard them, to give you the ability to kind of go through a library of completed vendor risk profiles and scores and real-time monitoring data for cyber, business, and financial events, and give you a picture to say, okay, these guys are pretty solid here. These guys got some risks here. Taking them on is going to have us, have some conversations about, do they meet our organizational risk profile? To the next step, all about intake and onboarding, simplifying that process as much as possible, and giving you a programmatic and workflow-based process to get somebody on board, get the profiling and tiering done, so that once you've assumed that yes, okay, we're going to move forward with this business, we've got some contracts in place, we'll get them onboarded and scored so that what type of assessment to perform after that. To the third step, which is the full scoring of inherent risks, and that picture, of course, will then help to prescribe what full assessment approach you take next, which is the next step, assessment and remediation. And we've got a library of something like 75 existing questionnaire templates that map to any number of compliance regulations, security frameworks, NIST, ISO, whatever. You can, and the ability to build them yourself as well. You can execute these. This process is fully automated on the back end. You see risks get registered in the central risk register with very prescriptive remediation guidance. Says we recommend you do X, Y, and Z to address what comes in. To the next piece, which adds more real-time element to it. Like we said, risks don't happen only when, or risks aren't just revealed, when you do your assessment. A lot happens in between them. We give you the opportunity to feed a continuous stream of data into your central risk register to help you, validate the results of those completed assessments on an annual basis, whatever your cadence is, or give you some, intermediate insight in between the assessment to say, okay, these guys have had a data breach. We found out about it. It changes their risk score. We need to then now execute an additional maybe assessment against them, against some of their data governance practices to minimize our exposure. Next step, it's not just, although primarily it's not just about the cybersecurity controls and data privacy controls and financial and reputational issues that organizations face, but it's also whether or not they're meeting their SLAs and their performance metrics. Our approach is to kind of integrate that into the assessment process, just like you would be assessing them against NIST 27701, for example. So feeding that data into consistent risk register, so you have their performance capability or their performance metrics, you have their security metrics and more. And then the last piece of our approach is the grave part of the cradle to grave. And that's making sure that as you offboard and terminate a vendor relationship, that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed, if you will. Data has been destroyed appropriately. To have the checklist process, to issue internal assessments, for example, to the IT security teams to make sure privileged access has been cut off, that vendor identities have been disabled and more. So there's your deprovisioning that relationship. You're also deprovisioning users, which then closes off, potential access, after the relationship ends to your system. And again, our approach isn't just about deploying a bunch of software in your environment. That's great, but our approach is differentiated in that we incorporate managed services to help perform the collection, the analysis, the reporting, the controls validation, and the remediation on your behalf. We back that up with a full slate of services and a dedicated team to help you manage that process through your life cycle. Next slide, please. And honestly, this is just a picture of kind of what I walked through just a minute ago on the previous slide. You can kind of see some of the benefits there and who wins. One of the biggest values that Prevalent delivers is that we can bring together internal teams that typically might not have the preponderance to kind of work together and get information shared between them because of competing priorities and whatnot. Our solution is usable by procurement teams, usable by IT security teams, and usable by risk and vendor and compliance and legal teams as well. And get those folks talking together, all on the same page, all looking at the same data, so you can make the same types of decisions. Less risk, faster onboarding, better visibility, better efficiency, time savings, and better assurance that you're completing the process according to best practices. Next slide, please. How we deliver this is really kind of a three-part solution. Our vendor intelligence network, which contains thousands of completed vendor risk profiles that you can check in and check out like a library to get that initial visibility of how those vendors are performing. Our vendor risk assessment services, where we perform VRM on your behalf, do the collection and analysis and remediation. And then finally, the platform, if you choose to go the self-service route, where you can automate the assessments and get some visibility from a monitoring perspective pretty quickly. We did a customer survey over the summer, and customers tell us they save us a bunch of time doing this. These are real customer quotes, saving 50% in manual labor, identifying risks 44% faster, and increasing their productivity by 3 times. And you can see some examples down there below of customers that have benefited by using us. So last slide from my perspective is, one of the biggest takeaways I had from Norman's presentation was the need to be more proactive and, gather intelligence and information from as many sources as possible to make an informed decision on, how to treat a particular vendor. Do they have the right controls in place? Are we making sure that, that they've got the right policies for privileged access, and more. And you can't achieve that just from a completed assessment. And that's why we have, multiple thousands of inputs that come into our product to help you make the right decisions on identifying risk and then moving it through the life cycle. So last slide for me, next slide. Our approach, I think we've explained pretty well here. It's very data driven. It's very unified, and it's very prescriptive. Having done this several hundred times before with other customers, we've got an approach that works to help get you from point A to point B and get you a little bit more proactive, a little bit less reactive, by assessing vendors at every stage of the vendor lifecycle. And that helps to mitigate some of those risks like what we've seen in the cyber attacks from today. So, hey, with that, that's all I wanted to share with you. Thank you. I'm going to pitch it back over to Amanda. I think Amanda's going to open it up for questions. We'd love to hear from you about today's presentation.
Yeah, we do have a couple of great questions, and I'll get them started. And while I start asking these, I'm going to throw up one more poll question for everybody. Some might have missed the first one. So we were just curious as to, maybe something struck a chord with you, especially what Scott was presenting as well. Are you guys looking to augment or establish a third-party risk management program for 2021? So feel free to utilize that while we're asking away here. And I'm going to ask these at random. The first one is, one of the issues I faced during due diligence is clients not sharing critical reports due to proprietary and confidentiality reasons, in parentheses, summary pen tests, BCP-DR test results, etc. How do you overcome that, especially in this virtual environment where on-site exams are not feasible? I mean, there's so much you can rely on SOC and audit reports, etc. It's a little ask advice kind of scenario.
Yeah,
you're muted again. Oh, there you are. Okay.
Would you like me to take that one, Amanda?
Yeah, please, Norman. Thanks.
Yeah. So I think there's two things here with that particular question. It is something commonly that we see. The first one is, and I hate to be negative on this, but sometimes it's used as an excuse. Sometimes organizations don't necessarily have the controls in place that we might expect. And I have seen that, frankly, used as an excuse. I think that organizations that have done a better job with maturity are willing to demonstrate that. And they're willing to, with the right assurances, they're willing to provide enough information that satisfies the concern that they've done it. And so, obviously on-site assessments were, oftentimes done for very critical vendors. Obviously, in a COVID world, they're not as typical. One of the things that I've seen work very effectively is people are using online meetings such as Zoom or Teams, where a basic amount of information can be used to demonstrate that there is evidence that these things are being done. And so you gave a great example of a summary of a pen test. I can't think of many reasons why a vendor wouldn't share that summary report with you. The intent of it is obviously to satisfy third parties. And so they should do that. If you wanted more detail about that data, that's something that they may be willing to have a conversation about or do a Zoom meeting to satisfy your concerns. And so I would suggest that if you're getting that as pushback, that you offer something like an online meeting, or you ask them to suggest another means that can demonstrate that evidence for you.
Yeah, it's a great response. Next question is, how do you recommend companies handle powerful third parties, for example, Microsoft, Salesforce, that refuse to participate in their assessment activities? I actually get this question a lot, but I'm going to make you answer it.
Well, there's a couple of schools of thought here. So you're absolutely right. You have to have a significant amount of leverage to get some of the organizations, as you mentioned in your example, to participate. And so and that leverage is typically spend. And so if your organization is spending a significant amount, you'll typically have additional access to that. In some instances, it's regulated. So I know there's certain banking regulations in Germany that give financial services certain audit rights. And so you may look at different regulations that may give you those rights that would encourage, coerce some of these organizations to help participate. So that's one thing. The second thing is that a lot of times you might get some from an industry group depending on what industry you're in, you may get some additional access. So if you can get together with some of your peers, potentially work with these organizations to have a conversation with them to give you more information, or perhaps even leverage some type of vendor network would certainly be very helpful there as well. So those are kind of two answers. The third one, which is commonly used, is and I know I mentioned Microsoft in one of the supply chain attacks. They're typically not the organizations that you're worrying about. They're in your example here, for example, Microsoft and Salesforce, these organizations contribute tremendous amount of resources to protecting their clients' data because it protects their business. And so I'm certainly not saying don't worry about them. That is not the message here. But should you have an opportunity to assess the controls that are in place, I think you'll find that they're very good. You have other organizations that are very forward-leaning. I think Amazon has done a tremendous job about putting out into the public forum a lot of their certifications and the information that they do. They're doing it essentially to be proactive and to reduce the number of inquiries that they get. And it also makes it easier for them to deny customer or one-off inquiries as well. But it's a great question. There's a number of different ways you can go about it. And I hope that answers the question.
Oh, I definitely think it does, for sure. I have a question regarding Prevalent itself, and one of it is, does the Prevalent platform have the ability to use a tier or categorization approach to request relevant content for review?
Yeah, absolutely. The platform's built in with a tiering and profiling assessment that you can issue to your third parties that will, require some internal folks to contribute to it, and of course the third party to contribute to it from a basic level. It will answer, the questions that will give you the inherent risk score and require the upload of required documentation, whether it's, your two-factor authentication policy or, your vendor remote access policy, something like that, right? So it does require the evidence to be uploaded when it does the calculation of the inherent risk.
Another question about Prevalent. Someone was curious, does Prevalent quantify risk?
Yes. Yeah, the short answer is yeah. We've got a model in the solution. It's like a 5x5 matrix that's based on likelihood and impact of a particular incident of some kind or an event. And that matrix, that 5x5 matrix, then you can weight the different squares in that matrix, like a heat map, like red, hot, blue, cold, whatever. Based on what's important to you, and it will auto-categorize the risk and quantify it based on what you've established, and then you can resort and kind of tackle the ones that are most important to you from there.
Perfect. And we have another question here. It says, how far down a supply chain do you recommend looking? Do you trust in your third-party risk management program, and they are properly assessing their third parties? Question mark.
That's a great question. I mean, I think the spurious answer is you have to look as far down as necessary, right? And so again, that kind of risk-adjusted approach of what is that third party doing? What access do they have storing, transmitting, or processing confidential or personal information or other assets that are important to your organization? We've seen a lot of evolution, if you will, over the assessment content that's being used to help determine the third party assessment programs. And I think it's important to focus on that to evaluate the maturity of your third parties. The other thing that we've seen too, and specific to GDPR, but I think it's probably a good example of where things can evolve and improve. In the new standard contractual clauses for GDPR, we're seeing an affirmative obligation for organizations to assess their third parties. And so this now becomes the third party of third parties around that. And that's something that's relatively new, and I think really does help if you will, enforce that, right? Because the only way to do this effectively when you start talking down into our nth parties is it really gets done at a community level. And so, the more organizations that do third-party risk assessment, the more organizations that are being assessed, and ultimately the community benefits from that collective assessment. So hopefully that answers that question.
I think it does. And I think we have time for about one more. This question is, do you recommend using threat intelligence to prioritize the vast vendor universe by way of using the intelligence as a starting point?
And who's that directed to, Amanda?
Well, there's no directive.
That's got Norman. That's got Norman written all over it.
That's what I was thinking too. You're in the hot seat, Norman.
Okay. Yeah, very good. So just real quick can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you recommend using threat intelligence to prioritize the vast vendor universe by way of using the intelligence as a starting point?
Yes. So I think is absolutely. If you think about it, we want to deploy the things that cost the least and give us the greatest result. And I think when you look at threat monitoring, it allows you very quickly to take a limited set of inputs. Sometimes it's as simple as a vendor name or vendor domain, and start to understand what that vendor's posture looks like. So, for example, have they had recent data breaches? Is there discussions about them on the dark web? Is there information related to their financial viability or perhaps their business continuity that's already out there and available to you? And you can get a very quick understanding about the vendors, predominantly that you want to look at first. And those are the ones that probably have the most externally represented risk. And I would say that that's a very quick and very effective way to go about doing a risk assessment classification of your vendors to determine what the next steps are.
Thank you so much. I know that was kind of a funky worded question, but we got there. Let's see, what time is it? I think we have time for one more. We do have one more, so I'm just going to throw it in. Recently, we've seen some fines levied against high-profile firms. Any comments on that? And what are some things that you think regulators will focus on in the future?
Yeah, so I would start off with, I'm aware of some of these fines. I haven't been tracking them or doing any type of analysis on them. The ones that I've heard about specifically around some of the violations of privacy, admittedly, I thought the fines were less than I would have expected. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Clearly GDPR has some teeth around it, and so do a number of the other data privacy regulations, but some of the fines I've seen recently have been surprisingly low, considering the size of the organizations at which the fines have been levied.
That's interesting. Well, that is all we have for today. Thank you all for those who participated in the Q&A and in the chat. We really do appreciate all those questions. Norman, it was such a pleasure meeting you, and thanks so much for your time today. Scott, always great to see you as always. That's all from us. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, info@prevalent.net, and you'll hear from myself, Amanda Farina. I'm in business development here at Prevalent, so you'll see myself as well. If you have any questions, we're here to help. And I just got to thank you. So it looks like everyone's pleased, and we're all grateful for the opportunity to talk with you, Norman. So thanks again. This will be in your inbox tomorrow, everyone. That's all for now. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.